Today is January 16th, 2019. This is Betsy Peterson, and I'm sitting here with Nancy Gross and Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimbett, and we are going to conduct an interview with Barbara today about her work and sort of life as and career as a folklorist, and many other things, and many other roles. So we'll just start it off.
Okay. Well, I think when I found folklore, I found my calling. And, well, let me sort of give you a sense of the path. That I would say from early childhood, I'd always been interested in the things that folklorists are interested in. I had read my way through all of the Lang fairy tale books, every color, in the Toronto Public Library, the blue fairy tale book, the pink, the yellow, the red. And I had always also been very interested in, I grew up during the folk music revival, so I've been interested in folk music. I've been interested in traditional crafts and embroidery. So all the things that folklorists are interested in had interested me, but had always just been a personal interest. They never had any, there was no academic basis for studying any of that because, you know, high school, primary school, and when it came time for university, I thought I would study anthropology at the University of Toronto, but it didn't seem like a very interesting or good department. So by default, I thought, you know, I'll just get educated. I'll do English literature. I know the language, and I'll read, and I'll be educated. But it was definitely not because I had a passion for English literature. And for a variety of reasons, my husband and I moved to San Francisco. He wanted to go to the San Francisco Art Institute, and I enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, and did my senior year there. And having gone to the University of Toronto, and it being a British system, when you did English literature, that's all you did. You had a whole year of Chaucer, a whole year of Shakespeare, a whole year of Anglo-Saxon.
As an undergraduate?
As an undergraduate, and a whole year of the Anglo-Saxon language, and a whole year of Anglo-Saxon literature. I never knew there was enough Anglo-Saxon literature to warrant an entire year, but apparently, yes. And so the only kind of electives was art history, which I took, and history of architecture, philosophy, which I took, and especially aesthetics. Near Eastern literature, we had to, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and French. And that was pretty much. I wanted to study Chinese. They said it's got nothing to do with English literature. So, and anthropology, the social sciences, no. So I get to Berkeley in my senior year. They look at my transcript and they say to me, you have more credit in English literature than you need for our master's. But what about your breadth requirements? Breadth requirements. I opened up the catalog. It was like a kid in a candy shop. I thought, oh my God, there are those folklore courses, and there's that history of textiles, 2 semesters on the history of textiles, and then there's, you know, social science this, and there's that. Well, I couldn't believe it. And also physics. I had to take the freshman physics class, but okay. So I go to see Alan Dundas, because I can't remember now whether I had to see him in order to get into his class. I don't remember the reason why. And I remember all his file cabinets. I remember him sitting behind his desk. And I sat down and talked to him, and I told him that I'd read all the Lang fairy tale books, and that you know, and I knew how to do 40 different cat's cradles, and you know, and I knew how to weave. I could do finger weaving and osage weaving, and I gave him the whole story. And it's like, you know, basically, he basically said, absolutely, take my courses. So essentially, when I finished my BA, my senior year, and I did my MA, even though it was in English literature, most of the courses I did with Alan and with Bertrand Bronson and with Alan Merriam. So I really, I would say I didn't need any units in English literature. I already had, you know, more than I needed for a master's. So in essence, I did a folklore MA, but I got an English literature degree. And Dundas, of course, being such a proselytizer for the field, he said, oh, you must go on for the PhD, and you have to study folklore, and the best place to go would be Indiana University. So I went to Bertrand Bronson. I took 2 semesters with Bertrand Bronson on the English and Scottish popular ballad, And then, of course, a lot on the tunes, and that was a whole other experience with Bronson. And a meeting at his house, at his home, around his dining room table, him putting on his old 78s with these cowboys singing these English and Scottish popular ballads. It was really a trip. So I remember going to Bronson saying, I need recommendations to be able to get into the folklore program at IU. And he said, absolutely not. I will not write your recommendation. This is professional suicide. He said, look, he said, you have to do a PhD in English literature. He said, I have a PhD in English literature, and I studied the English and Scottish popular ballads. There's no reason why you would, what's a PhD in folklore? So I never got a recommendation from him, but of course from Alan I did. And I applied, and of course I got in. And everybody, all my friends and everybody in San Francisco said, are you out of your mind? You're going to go to Bloomington, Indiana, in the middle of nowhere, and how could you possibly leave the Bay Area? And I thought to myself, well, it's the best place to study folklore. It simply is the best place to study folklore. And so we basically packed up our stuff, got on a Greyhound bus, and we took a Greyhound, because we had no money at all, took a Greyhound bus across country, got to Bloomington, Indiana. Oh, it's another whole story. But anyway, that's how we got there.
Okay. And how long were you there?
So in Bloomington, it was from, okay, so we went to the University of California, Berkeley, 65.
Mm-hmm. And we being you and your husband, Max Gimblett.
And so we were there 65 to 67. Fall of 67, I started at IU, and I was there for 3 academic years. And then in 1970, I got my first tenure-track job at the University of Texas in Austin. We were there for 2 years. And then I had a big NEA grant to do a major fieldwork project on the Yiddish folk song with the last living singers, traditional singers. So we came to New York. And then once in New York, I got a visiting position at Columbia University. And then in 74, I got hired at University of Pennsylvania in Philly.
This is my timeline is a little bit off. I thought you were at Texas later and Penn later, but you were gone from Penn by...
I was gone from Penn by, I would say I had a sabbatical in the fall of 1980, so my appointment at NYU formally began in the spring of 81.
And what was your dissertation on?
Oh, it was on traditional storytelling in the Toronto Jewish immigrant community.
And you had grown up in?
I grew up in Toronto. And the dissertation really grew out of the Yiddish folklore survey that I did for the Center for Folk Life, I think it's called, at what was then called the Canadian National Museum in Ottawa. Now it's the Museum of Civilization. And they changed the name again.
Yeah. Is that where Shelley?
Yeah, Shelley Posen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, later. I mean, actually, the time that I was doing the survey, Robert Klimash was the director of the center.
Did you grow up with singing in your family, or do you want to talk a little bit about your music?
Yes, well, in
credentials?
my family, my father played the violin. He learned violin as a child, and he loved Don Messer and his Islanders, the maritime kind of Canadian Western, but maritime Eastern band. And then they, had their music books. So on a Sunday morning, I would play the piano, and he would, play these fiddle tunes from Don Messer and his Islanders. But my parents wanted us to learn classical piano. So the 3 daughters, all of us, studied classical piano. But there was a moment, and that would have been the late 60s. My mother's sister, because my mother was the middle of 3, and her sister, who was the oldest, was a manufacturer sales representative for ladies' lingerie and dresses, and very successful. And she had a suite in the Royal York Hotel where she had her showroom, and she also lived there. And I remember that, we were invited for dinner, and she would order in, of course. And a cousin, my mother's cousin, was at the table. And my mother's sister, her name was Sylvia, after the dinner was more or less over, she turned to the cousin, to Mariam, and she said, "Mariam, sing." And Mariam started singing. And I almost fainted when I heard this woman, this is a woman I knew all my life. I had no idea she was a 100% traditional singer in my own family with a whole repertoire in Yiddish, in mixed language, which is essentially a kind of Belarusian, because she was from this border area between Poland and Belarus. And she had this wonderful, bright voice, and this sort of slightly that kind of Belarusian vocal style. And she had this wonderful repertoire. She was really difficult too. Oh my God, she made my life miserable. But that aside, I just sat there and I thought I had no idea in my wildest dreams that this person who was part of my family and my life, I'd never heard her sing. I'd never heard anybody talk about her singing. And then my mother told me that she grew up in, well, it wasn't, they called it a village, but I think it was more like a very small town, not far from the city where my mother was born and lived, in Brest-Litovsk. And she would come and stay with my mother's family, and they would be in the same bed, and my mother would pinch her and make her sing all night long. So it was clear that they, those who really knew her knew, and they loved her songs and her singing. So then I recorded her entire repertoire, and we issued, first of all, an LP, and then it came out as a cassette, and then it came out as a CD. And actually, I think Library of Congress gave us an award for Best Recording of the Year.
What was the title of
It
that?
was called Folk Songs from the East European Jewish Tradition, Mariam Nierenberg. And Kay Chalamet, I think, was on the jury or something. Mm-hmm. So it got an award that year. So that was a real revelation. Now, I had recorded some songs when I was doing the survey, the Yiddish Folklore Survey in the 60s. I had some of the people I recorded were singing. But in terms of my own family, I wouldn't, she's the one, Mariam Nierenberg, she was the one. And that was just an astonishing find. I couldn't believe it.
What was the experience of doing field research with your own family or your community?
Well, what happened was that in that first semester at IU, I think I was taking, with Felix Oinis, I was taking the Russian folklore class, because Felix did everything. He was Estonian, but he taught Russian folklore, he taught everything. And the textbook was Sokolov, it was Soviet era, big fat textbook with a red cover. I still have it, of course. And I remember coming home at Thanksgiving with the textbook and sitting at the kitchen table. It was a Sunday morning, and I'm reading, and I'm open up the chapter on death, and I start reading. And I think, oh gosh, that's interesting. And my father's reading the newspaper, and my mother's at the kitchen washing dishes. And I open it up, and I start to read. I said, listen to this. They say that when somebody dies, they lay the body out with the feet towards the door so that the dead shouldn't find their way back in. But they put a glass of water on the windowsill, and they open the window, and they put a little towel there that the soul, as it exits, it should wash itself, and it should dry itself off. And my father says, that's what we did. Really? What else did you do? So it I thought, wow, I should start asking some questions here. So I quickly discovered that the biggest treasure that I collected from my parents were, in fact, stories. In my mother's case, it was parables, and it was the first article, it was the first paper I ever gave at AFS was an analysis of one of her parables. And the first paper I ever published was an analysis of one of her parables, and it was also translated into Hebrew, and it was just kind of astonishing that was kind of a starting point. And from her, I got parables and proverbs. And from my father, I got, I would say, stories and jokes. But from my mother's brother, who was younger, he was a master storyteller, an absolute master. And everybody knew it. They all knew that he could be a Toastmaster. He could be a stand-up comic, and his were really traditional. They were really traditional stories. So, when I discovered I had, Mariam was singing, and Motl was telling these great stories, and then when he would get together with my father's brothers, and they all sit around and start telling stories. Like I had a joke telling and a storytelling session that was unbelievable. So it just kind of mushroomed from there, and then I kind of extended out to people that they knew and people that were referred to me. Some of them were Holocaust survivors, some of them had come before the war, and I just kind of networked out, and that was for the survey. And then really from that, I realized that I could really create the dissertation out of that kind of material, and I focused specifically, although what I did for the survey is I included toys and magic and amulets and obviously stories and proverbs and riddles. I mean, I included everything in the survey, but for the dissertation, I focused on storytelling. And I looked, for example, at the way in which multilingual storytellers really use the full range of their linguistic resources in a very witty way. And that was a whole chapter, was just on code switching in storytelling. Another one was on the parable. It was on repertoire and an analysis, really, of the artfulness of storytelling. That was the dissertation.
Did your parents read it?
Oh, yes, of course. And they were, of course, my parents, like this, my father finished 7 grades of Polish primary school. And my mother, I'm not even sure that she even finished primary school. But very intelligent people, very well read. They loved music, and they were absolutely dedicated that their daughters should be well educated and should be independent. So they had a very progressive attitude to the daughters. They said, we want you to be independent. God forbid you're left without a husband or whatever. You should be able to support yourself. You should be able to, make your way in the world. So, on the other hand, education for them was like a lifelong project. So in my 3rd year at IU, there was the AFS meetings. I presented this parable paper. Right after it, Roger Abrams, Dick Bauman offered me the job at Texas, which, and everybody said, Texas? Now you're going to go to Texas? From San Francisco to Bloomington, and now Austin? At the time, was a very sleepy state capital. There was nothing happening. I said, yes, it's wonderful. It's a 10-year track job. It's Richard, it's Roger, a chance to teach folklore. I mean, what could be better? So off we go. But before, when I got the job offer, so I go to a payphone and I call Collect, of course, because we have no money. And my father answers, and I say, Dad, listen, I just got a job. I just got a job at the University of Texas. He says, call back. Your mother will be home soon. You can explain everything. And it's like that. Whoa, what's the problem? So then the problem was no, and he said, he says, you don't have to quit school. He said, that we'll help you for as long as you want to study. And I thought, well, don't tell my advisor that, But because he didn't understand that you graduate. He understood you graduate from public school, from high school, but he didn't understand that you actually stop at a certain point and that you go on and you have a career. He didn't understand that. So it took a while for them to get it, but they got it, and they were, of course, very, very, very pleased. But when you ask, did they read it? When I put together the manuscript for the book based on the interviews that I did with my father, because I had like more than 40 years worth of interviews recorded, and I transcribed part of them. I got somebody else to help me transcribe, and then I took this mass of material because I often had him tell the same story, 5, 6, God knows how many times. So I took this material and I started to put it into some kind of an order, and then it became more and more kind of settled. And I would give it to him, the whole manuscript, and I say to him, so read it and then mark anything that's wrong or it's missing or it's not clear or something. And I'd see that he was like this. And I'd say, so what do you think? He'd go, it reads like a novel.
Was he pleased with that?
He loved it. He was thrilled. And it was such an interesting process because what would happen, that was different from the dissertation. The dissertation, I basically was writing it in Texas. Mm-hmm. And I was just running it furiously because I had to finish it in order to accept the job at Columbia. And so, but on They Call Me Meyer July, on the book based on the interviews, it was a real collaboration at every stage. So what was really interesting was to re-interview him in relation to what was in the book that was either not clear or that was something was missing. And at certain points, I just said to him, well, just write it out. And then actually he did some writing, short, but he did some of his own kind of writing. And then so it was kind of a very interesting kind of mixture of a way of working to produce that. But he loved it, actually. It reads like a novel. And I thought, oh, good, that's
Nothing
good.
about jargon.
No, oh, no way, no way. And I'll tell you what was interesting, pardon me, in the creating of that book. So I decided from the very beginning that the whole book would be from the interviews. And because I thought of all kinds of ways of experimenting, very kind of experimental, and it would be me and him. I thought, no me. It's all him. Number one. Number two, I decided no famous person writing an introduction about how wonderful it all is. No Cynthia Ozick, no Philip Roth, no, Elie Wiesel. No, absolutely not. The book would begin, and he would introduce himself, and it would start with him, and he'd be in full command of the whole book. But I would have my word, and it would come at the very end. And it's called A Daughter's Afterword. The whole book is in color. The Daughter's Afterword is in black and white, with only drawings and prints and that kind of thing. And in The Daughter's Afterword, I figured if anybody got that far and wanted to read it, I wanted that my parents should read it and be able to understand it. That was my assumption is that they were intelligent. And at the same time, I really wanted to try to somehow capture, on the one hand, my personal connection to this whole thing, but also my insights into what it was we had created together. So but no jargon. That's first rule. That you can say everything you want to say in plain, clear language.
You can.
You can. You just have to want to.
If you're good, yes.
You just have to want to.
Excellent. Now, you said you had two sisters. Were they interested at all in?
Well, I'm the oldest of three, and my sisters were very supportive, for sure. But they really had different lives. My middle sister has raised a wonderful family, and she was a bookkeeper, she's a travel agent, and she took wonderful care, she and her husband, of my parents as they got older, because they were living in Toronto, and I have been living in New York. But this was never her project, and although she was extremely supportive. My youngest sister, who passed away in her 40s, she actually was a music teacher, and ran, conducted mass choirs, and she was really wonderful, and she was very supportive too. But this was really, I would say, the project that I did with my father. My mother was extremely supportive, and so was my husband, who's an artist. And so when my father began painting, they actually found a way to connect with each other that they had never known before. So they would have conversations about painting, and they would go to art exhibitions together, and it was really actually quite wonderful.
Excellent.
So you finished your dissertation, went to Columbia, and then
So what happened
how long
was,
were you at Columbia?
So what happened was that I got the NEA grant, and I applied for it through and with the Yiddish Institute for Jewish Research. Mm-hmm. And there was a Yiddish Studies program that was a collaboration between Columbia's Linguistics Department and the Max Weinreich Center at YIVO.
Just to back up for a minute, did you grow up in a Yiddish-speaking home?
Yes.
And what flavor Yiddish were you speaking?
Oh, well, so of course my parents, my grandparents, everybody spoke Yiddish. And my parents sent me to a Yiddish after school. Uh-huh. And the Yiddish after school was not Sunday. It was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. So it wasn't enough that I had public school. I had 2 hours a day of Yiddish after school and piano lessons. So if I'm not a sporty type, you can imagine why. There's no tennis lessons in my inner city, public school. There was Danish rounders. I don't even know what that is. It's kind of like baseball without a base,
Yeah,
without a
it's
ball.
rounders, yeah.
Whatever. And I was when they finished picking the teams, whoever, like I was the leftover. They got stuck with me. So in any event, so I went to this Yiddish after school. The Yiddish was spoken at home. My parents, if they didn't want me to understand, they spoke Polish. And my mother being from Brest-Litovsk, which is on the border of Belarus, so she's what they call a Litvak, which is a different Yiddish, and my father, being from South Central Poland, is a different Yiddish. And then when I came to New York, I actually even earlier came to the Yiddish summer program in New York, and in the morning I'd go to the intermediate and advanced Yiddish classes.
Was that at YIVO?
Yes, it was organized by YIVO and Columbia. So I would go to the Yiddish classes, intermediate and advanced in the morning, and in the afternoon I would teach. So I would teach Yiddish folklore or whatever it was in the afternoon, but I would do the language classes because the Yiddish that I had learned as a child was not adequate to what I felt I would need and that I needed as a professional. So that's what I did. So I was teaching at Columbia. I actually taught part-time or a course or two at Columbia for years after that for YIVO because they had this joint program. But I started at Penn in '74. I started at Penn full-time.
And who was at Penn when you got there? Because that was sort of the powerhouse program.
It was
in
Del
74.
Himes, John Schwed, Roger Abrams, Henry Glassy, of course Kenny Goldstein, that's 5, Dan Benamos, and then there was Irving Goffman and what's his name?
Ray Birdwhistle?
Birdwhistle was there, and I'm trying to think who was the one that did gesture and stuff like that. I'll remember who it is in a minute.
Paul?
Not Paul.
Del.
Not Del. I have to remember who it was. Also very wonderful guy.
I know, it's on the tip of my tongue.
And who were the students? Do you remember who the students were? when you
Yes,
got there?
it's interesting. I have a better memory. Well, I have to think about it because I get mixed up between the graduate students at IU, because that I remember, like Tom Burns, Elliot Oring, Roseanne Jordan, Frank DeCaro. I'm trying to remember.
Did Raina overlap
And
with you?
Raina overlapped, but then I think at Penn was Lee Ellen, right? I think Lee Ellen was there. Chava Weissler, Sholem Staub, Mick Maloney.
Saul Brody?
Saul Brody, yes. And where was Shelley Posen? Was he at
He was at
IU?
Penn.
Was he at Penn?
Yeah, I thought Shelley and Max were at
Yes,
Penn.
they were
with
at
you.
Penn. They were at Penn, right. Because IU and Penn, I get them mixed up because I know them afterwards as kind of one group of folklorists. So, but it was a great experience. It was an incredible period. It was a golden age. Absolutely incredible.
That's actually what I wanted to ask you about. I mean, you went to UT and then Penn, and yeah, that is a very heady time for folklore. I mean, the great growth and expansion.
And also
was
that
going on.
I studied at Berkeley, I studied at IU, I taught at Texas, I taught at Penn, and I mean, the only place I never taught, although I did serve on a dissertation committee, was St. John's in Newfoundland, and then some of the other smaller programs that were MA programs. But I also taught at IU one summer. But to experience those 4 flagship folklore programs in their heyday, that is a unique moment in time. That is an historical moment, and it'll never be replicated.
I think you're right.
You know, and those folklorists were in their prime. They really were, Henry, Roger, Dick, Alan, Dan, they were in their prime.
Was there a lot of collaboration, or, I mean, how did you all?
You know, it's interesting. I would say that There was collaboration in the sense that, let's say, like for example, Dick and Charles Briggs were close collaborators. So there were instances of, and I think John and Roger were very close. But my collaboration was rather, for example, in the Yiddish Folk Song Project, I led a whole team of collectors. And so I don't remember team projects as such. And I don't remember co-authoring or working collaboratively on any projects. I don't. The Yiddish Folk Song Project was a collaboration. The project on the Jewish photography in Poland, the history of Polish Jews through photography, that was a collaboration.
That image before my
Image
eye.
Before Eyes was a collaboration. With my father was a collaboration. In other words, personally, I worked very collaboratively. I co-edited volumes with Jeffrey Chandler, with Jonathan Karp. I cooperated with my father. I worked with Lucian Dobrzycki. I worked with Sissy Grossman at the Jewish Museum on the textile exhibition. So personally, I have always, all my major projects were collaborative. All of them. And I love working collaboratively. When I played piano, I loved duets, and I especially liked playing the bottom part.
So you were at, you then were lured away, because you were already living in New York, right? You were lured away by NYU. And could you talk a little bit about how, because you were at NYU, you still are associated with NYU, but you gradually went into performance studies.
So what
Can you
happened?
talk about that?
So, okay,
Yeah.
so what happened was that I was very happy at Penn. I got tenure. Everything was okay. And I thought to myself, it's a flagship program. It's a Ivy League university. You know, even though I had to commute from New York, it just seemed to me worth it. It was just totally worth it. And then I think that a bunch of us, Nancy, Barbara Klein, Steve Zeitlin, Amanda Dargan, Robert Barron, there were a bunch of folklorists in the city, and we had nothing. You know, New York Folklore Society was moribund at the time. There was no folklore program anywhere. Ole Herring was around, but there was
Jerry
no.
Warshaver.
Yeah, exactly. But there was no folklore program. There was no center. There was just a bunch of like folklore orphans that were scattered around the city, and there was nothing happening. And somehow we decided, and I mean like we literally, because Nancy was part of our sort of group. We decided we're going to make something happen. That even if we have no institutional base and there's no, but how can we build awareness and interest that might actually lead to something more institutional? So we started doing these conferences on the folklore of New York City, working with Marty Cooper and with Henry Chalfant. And it was also a very interesting time in the city. This would have been in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, 79 was the first big
79,
conference.
exactly. When the city was on the verge of bankruptcy, and what that did was create an enormous opening for vernacular expression. It was the era of the community gardens and the casitas and subway graffiti, and then it became breakdancing and all the rest of it. And it was a kind of, it was as if the city had lost control of itself, and it was, you know, going down on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had all these vacant lots, and people were just simply taking them and doing things, extraordinary things. So we organized these conferences and these events, and it was, I would say, it was kind of, you know, if we can't do it institutionally, we'll just do it ourselves. So in the course of all of this, I approached NYU because I heard, I saw some flyers for a seminar in performance theory. We did performance theory, you know, in folklore. Right. So I thought, performance theory, really? And I give a look, who's teaching the seminar? Richard Schechner, I didn't know who he was. Barbara Meyerhoff, Irving Goffman. There was, I think, Ellen Alond. I can't remember now. There's several other people, but I certainly recognized Goffman, Meyerhoff, etc. Right. I thought to myself, who's this Richard Schechner? So I call him up, and I said, I'd like to meet you. I think that we have some things to talk about. And he at the time had a little apartment in Little Italy, and I love the guy, he's a very dear friend. Anyway, I went to see him, and he's sitting cross-legged on the floor, barefoot, writing or something. And this is our first meeting. And we get talking, and I say, listen, we want to organize this conference, and we think maybe NYU would be a host, because we had done it at Hunter. And so then he introduced me to Brooks McNamara, who was his colleague who worked on popular entertainment, vaudeville and stuff like that. And they all thought it was kind of good, and they helped us to get NYU to be the venue for one of our big Folklore of New York City conferences. So that's how I got to know them. And then out of the blue, I get a phone call from Richard. And he says, hi, Barbara, this is Richard Schechner. How would you like to chair our department? I said, well, at the time it was the Graduate Department of Drama. Number one, I had absolutely zero interest in chairing a department of drama, but I also had zero interest in chairing. I said, well, not really. He said, how about lunch? I said, sure. So
We'll start with lunch.
we'll start with lunch. So they book a table at the Granta Chino, may it rest in peace. It was one of those great old-time village restaurants, Italian restaurants. You go down a couple of stairs, and inside it's all dark green with sconces and white tablecloths and old waiters. So we meet at the Granta Chino, and it's a small, merry band of Richard Schechner, Brooks McNamara, Michael Kirby, and Ted Hoffman. And the first thing that impressed me was that these guys like each other, and they get along. That I was very impressed. The second thing that impressed me was that they were actually involved in off-Broadway experimental performance, but they were teaching drama from Antigone to O'Neill, something like this. That there was a complete disconnect between the performances that they were making and what they were teaching. And the third thing was that this performance theory seminar that Richard had been running was in fact the kind of laboratory for the developing of a new field. And that they were looking for someone to, quote, chair their department, because the dean, who was a concert clarinetist and had been the head of a record company, Columbia or something, had said to them, you either get your act together or I'm going to close you down. So they decided to get their act together. And what did that mean? That they were going to hire a chair. They were going to change the name of the department from Graduate Department of Drama to the Department of Performance Studies. And they were going to, make it happen. And they asked me if I would chair the department. So I thought, well, performance studies, this already is something I can wrap my head around. Chairing, not really, but maybe I can convince them to create a folklore department. I mean, this is delusional, but this is how I was thinking. And I remember calling up Alan Dundas and saying to him, would it be a complete betrayal to the field if I were to leave this folklore, department at Penn and go to NYU? And I said to him, and I checked all the courses through the whole university, and I can see how if I take from the School of Ed and from the English department and from here and from there, I can put together a whole curriculum for folklore. And I went to the dean who's hiring me to chair a department of performance studies, and I presented him with a folklore program. And of course, he was a very wise guy. He just sort of sat there and, oh, really? What are you thinking?
Yeah.
So then I thought, well, maybe, I'll take the job. It has the advantage, I'd be in New York City, I wouldn't have to commute. And while I'm there, and I still had the illusion that I would be able to create a folklore program at NYU, which was, really completely ridiculous. And then what I really discovered, and then the other thing was, I was convinced they'd made a terrible mistake. That they had no idea what they were doing, and that about 2 years later, they'd figure it out and it'd be too late. Of course, it was too late the moment they hired me because I was with tenure anyway. So I developed my first course.
Which was what?
The Aesthetics of Everyday Life.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember you.
and I was convinced that absolutely, first of all, I had to defend it to the curriculum committee because they couldn't figure out what the hell it was about. And of course, it was all fieldwork based, and it involved going out into the city, the Stations of the Cross, Purim plays, it was Halloween parade, and it was Chinese New Year. It was all that stuff. It was black churches preaching, and I was convinced nobody would take this course, and that then they would see what a disaster it was, that they'd hired the wrong person, and what are you going to do? what are you going to do? So it was oversubscribed, and I look around the room. I said, "Who are you, and why are you taking this course?" Choreographers, directors, actors, dancers, and what they said, and then I understood. They said, "Listen, we've had enough theater history and enough of drama and everything else to last us a lifetime." And the kind of performance they were creating out of everyday life. It was the period of postmodern dance, and it was the period of environmental theater, and so it was really a very special moment in the history of the avant-garde in New York and off Broadway. And so I really discovered an extraordinary group of very creative, very dedicated students, and who were extremely receptive. They loved it. And I basically then sort of found my footing. And the wonderful thing was that I was teaching, what did I teach? I taught Jewish folklore. I taught what I called museum theater, food and performance, but basically, always which had been the hallmark of my work anyway, with a performance approach anyway.
Right.
So I was the one who really did basically everything and anything that was not a formal stage production. So let it be circus parades, ritual, festival, and so did Richard. He did too. But mine would also include storytelling, it would include graffiti, it would include food, it included sort of all the kinds of things that folklorists would do, but done with this very much of a performance angle, I would say, which I could easily and might very well have done in a folklore program. Wouldn't have been any different. So that's what I did.
Did Richard Schechner, when you had that meeting with the four of them, do you think they had the sense that this seminar that he was teaching, that you said was the core of
Yes. I think they knew. They knew that was that. And you know what was interesting is one of the reasons I think, I hope there were other reasons, but one of the reasons that they invited me to take the position was that I didn't come from theater. They were worried if they hired somebody from theater, they would never, ever, ever be able to take this very strong non-theatrical. In other words, it wasn't that they didn't teach theater, they did, like stage design and technology and dramaturgy and whatnot, but they really wanted to make sure that they're going to do performance studies and that it would not be defined first and foremost as theater plus. So that was important to them, that I didn't do theater, but that I did do performance in everyday life. That was how they understood what I did. So that was okay. And it was now Deborah Kapchin now is on our faculty, so there's another folklorist. So actually, finally, it turned out to be really the gift of a lifetime. It was a great move, really, really great move, and wonderful colleagues. To this day, that faculty gets along. To this day, in the entire time since I came there, since I could see what was going on in the early 80s, these are people who are really good people, good scholars, and they get along. And I think that's really very precious.
Yeah, it is very precious. Did moving to the performance studies and beginning to kind of combine or integrate contemporary art or avant-garde approaches with traditional art, vernacular art, was that a leap? Was that just a natural progression? Or?
Well, I'll tell you what was easy about it, and that is that if you look at the history of the avant-garde, particularly, let's say, sort of like Bauhaus and and more, you see a rejection of traditional stage performance and an embrace of, you know, cranes and circus and, in other words, a kind of rejection of the conventions of theater and a discovery of the, if you will, potential for artistic inspiration from industrial structures, I mean, literally, and from traditional performance. So there was a way in which the avant-garde had already prepared the ground by saying that we take our inspiration from, you know, parades and speeches and circus and carnival and all of these other forms.
Away from artifice.
Yeah. So I think that there was a kind of common, there was a kind of convergence there, right, sort of at the heart of the historical avant-garde. So, and I had always been interested in, I mean, I'm married to a contemporary artist, so we'd always been around the contemporary art scene and, you know, for music, for theater, performance, as well as the visual arts. So in terms of my own life, I was living in all those worlds anyway, and so was very comfortable in them. And so in a sense, it was no big leap for me, not at all.
Actually, because I had wanted to ask you about your husband, Max, and his career as an artist and how that may have influenced you, or what was that like being,
well,
or is
you know,
like,
you know,
I
I'll
guess.
tell you what's interesting is that when we first got together, I was very interested in, well, I always gravitated more towards, I would say, ceramics, textiles, and I taught arts and crafts and ran arts and crafts programs. So, but I was never that interested in painting and drawing. That wasn't my thing, but ceramics, weaving, leather, copper, enamel, 100%. I was cool with, in fact, I even belonged to the Canadian Handicrafts Guild and demonstrated for them. So in material culture, yes. And when I met my husband, he was a potter, he was a ceramist. He then sort of shifted from ceramics to painting. And we were actually both going to art classes at night, drawing and painting. And at a certain point, we just made a division of labor. He would do the visual thing, and I would do the other thing, whatever it was, you know, writing, literature, you know, whatever it was. And so, in a way, what was very gratifying for me was that that part of what I loved, I would live with. And that I would be doing something. It wasn't that I was doing what was left over, something else, but there were a lot of other things that I was interested in doing. And I was also on an academic path, which he was not. His mother took him out of school when he was 15. So he's a completely self-taught, self-made person. And I'm like the exact opposite, you know. I kind of went to the ends of the earth. I decided that, well, the experience I had was this. I spent a year in Israel between high school and university. I was 18, and I remember that when I was there, I got very interested in Jewish Yemenite embroidery, which is fantastic. Beautiful. And the curator responsible for that material in the ethnographic division of the Israel Museum was very kind and gave me access to that material. And then during that year, she said to me, you know, if only you had a bachelor's degree, she said, I would hire you, or something to that effect. And then when I heard that, and of course I was just out of high school, and I was obviously going to go to university, I said to myself, no one will ever again say to me, if only you had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a PhD. Never. I will go the whole route, and there'll be nothing missing. So I think that that really gave us two very different paths, that Max went the art route and I went the academic route. But our mutual interest in the arts was something that we shared all of our lives.
You brought up museums. Do you want to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about how you got into museums?
Well,
So
you
here
know-
you are happily teaching away at NYU with
Yeah.
enthusiastic
building a
students
big
and
program.
Yeah, but you know,
Yeah,
but
and
I'll tell you,
stuff.
the crazy thing about museums, I just, you know, it really, really and truly started with childhood. It started literally with my going to the Royal Ontario Museum every single Saturday. There's 6 floors. I did 1 floor a week, each Saturday a different floor. They had 2 totem poles up the stairwells. This Canadian Museum, of course. Mm-hmm. They had Native Americans on the basement. They had mannequins in big glass cases, rubbing sticks together to make fire, and of course all kinds of Native American artifacts. And then the main floor, they had fantastic geology, and then they had great Greek attic vases, and they had a fabulous china collection, and they had decorative arts and furniture. And it wasn't like I think I love the Native American stuff, and the Greek attic vase is the best. But it wasn't as if I had a passion for rocks or Chinese, whatever. It just didn't matter to me. And the best part was it was the same every week, year after year. Nothing changed. That was the best. That was the absolute best. And it wasn't an exhibition, it was the collection. Basically, it was the collection. And after I'd done several rounds of these 6 floors, I would get desperate, so I would go nearby in Queen's Park. There was the Sigmund Samuel Gallery of Canadiana. That was a bit desperate. That was usually good for 1 visit after, every few months. But that was Cornelius Craighoff and his beautiful paintings of rural life in 19th century Quebec. I mean, you can imagine for a kid, this is okay. And then, after I did that a few times, I sort of would go further afield to the Art Gallery of Ontario, and that was a group of 7. And that was pretty good too, but nothing could sustain me like the Royal Ontario Museum. So my dream was to work there. That was my dream. I was a kid, but my dream was to be, if I could have slept there, I would have slept there, but to work there. And sure enough, when I was 18, I actually got a job in the education department. Oh. So I started in the education department at the ROM when I was 18. I remember working with Eugenia. I can't remember her last name, but I think if I remember correctly, she was, spinster is not a word you hear these days. But in any event, she was not married, and I don't believe ever intended to or whatever, and she was a vegetarian, and she only wore rubber shoes. No leather, no leather. So, but she, I don't know, but anyway, she hired me. I worked there. And then I would say that when I got to Berkeley, I did this 2-semester sequence on the history of textiles. Mm-hmm. That was like I went to heaven. Absolutely delicious 2 courses. Then when I got to Texas, Indiana, no, I did material culture course with Warren Roberts. It was terrible.
Yeah, I did that too.
It was
terrible.
Terrible. He would just make a list on the board. Chairs, tables, baskets. It was just
Except we went to the cemetery in Bedford. That actually was fantastic.
Yeah, but also the best thing was when he would bring in a Windsor chair and he would just wax ecstatically about the Windsor chair. He'd put the Windsor chair on a table and he would just go on and on and on about the Windsor chair. I mean, that's what I remember about Warren. That was material culture, and that didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So then when I went to Texas, the University of Texas had a marvelous, marvelous collection of Mexican toys. I can't remember who made the collection, I don't recall now, but there was a desire to exhibit it. And I remember trying to work on that, but it never went anywhere. And so it was really only when I got to New York and the first opportunity to do a major exhibition was Image Before My Eyes, was on that photography collection with Lucien Dobrzycki, this wonderful man. And then on the strength of that, the Jewish Museum, which is where the venue for the exhibition, asked me to co-curate an exhibition of textiles from their collection. So I had an opportunity to work with their textile collection, and that was a trip because I was crazy about textiles and had done a lot of, I'd taken those 2 semesters on the history of textiles. I was a weaver, and so the opportunity to work with that material was just stunning. So that was that, and then there was the Smithsonian, the Folklife Festival, the bicentennial year.
In 76.
Yeah, in 76. And then I'm trying to think, there were some smaller things here and there. But then I'm not sure how it happened, but I got interested in the history of how Jews were exhibited or how they exhibited themselves, and started to write about it. And started to write about, oh, I know, there was that conference that produced the book Exhibiting
Ivan
Cultures.
Karp,
Yeah, Ivan and Steve Levine.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember that I wrote a paper for that conference, but my paper was towards the end. And as I was listening to the conference, I remember Alpers, I can't remember her first name. It was something about visual interest. That if something's not of visual interest, it shouldn't be shown, it shouldn't be exhibited. There's no point, because you only want to exhibit something that's worth looking at. And I thought, really? And I took my paper, I said, I'm not going to deliver this paper. And I sat there, and as I listened to all the people I disagreed with, I put together my thoughts, and I stood up, and I gave it to them. And then I went home, and I wrote it up, and that became Objects of Ethnography.
Oh, okay.
So I think, I'm trying to think if that was my first major essay on a museum exhibition subject. It might have been. It might have been. And I think this was, this idea of the poetics and politics of culture was kind of, I think, the kind of opening that got me going in terms of writing about museums and exhibition and World's Fairs and stuff like that.
I love the article about the Los Angeles Festival.
Oh, that was another amazing thing.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that not understanding it is like a precondition for appreciating it. That, you know, Michael Kirby said, or Richard, they prefer to turn the sound off when they're watching something. You know, there was something about that I just found so interesting. But those are opportunities. It's a real case there for conferences and those kinds of events, because they can actually generate some kind of insight or way of thinking that just sitting by yourself, it wouldn't happen.
Well, and a cross-fertilization of people coming from different perspectives.
Exactly.
But, well, and then I think through this work, this begins to get you moving towards UNESCO or ICH, intangible cultural heritage, intangible heritage.
You know, I'm trying to think, when that happened, I think there was a kind of a gathering, one of many probably gatherings, organized by the Smithsonian.
2001.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And also, Diana Taylor had been working with Lourdes. I think she was with the Paris office. And they organized something on heritage, intangible heritage. So there were a couple of opportunities like that that I was involved in that got me really thinking about it. Pardon me. So it was really precipitated by that initiative to create the category and the attempt of folklorists to deal with it, with all of to help to define it more sharply, but on the other hand, to expose how complicated it was to be thinking in those terms, and also, having identified intangible heritage, it's like letting the genie out of the bottle. Then you have governments trying to own it,
Right.
And sort of, and all the issues. I know. I'll tell you what was a critical moment. A really critical moment would have been around 1982, when Edward Bruner invited me to join him to co-teach a study abroad program for American undergraduates. It was called International Honors Program, I think they called it, IHP. It was established by Margaret Mead many years ago, and the idea was to take American students for a full academic year, and everything would be homestays, and they would be exposed to other cultures, and that kind of thing. So he had intended to do it with a colleague, and he had set it up as a curriculum in tourism, that it would be an anthropology year, but the focus would be tourism. And things did not work out with a colleague, and at the very last minute I get a phone call from him. I didn't know him ahead of time. Would I like to be his co-teacher and join him for this 9 months of study abroad? And it was not about, ship. There was no, we weren't on a ship somewhere. We literally, flew to San Francisco, got disoriented, and then, it was 6 weeks in Japan, in Kobe. We went from Japan to, where did we go from Japan? I think to India, or to Bali, to India, Singapore for a week, Nairobi, Cairo, Jerusalem. I'm wondering if I left something out. And it was amazing. But then I realized he put together a kind of crazy curriculum. I said, Ed, what are you doing? Why in Japan are we reading about Africa? Because he had some anthropology curriculum in mind, and I don't know whether he was going chronologically in the history of anthropology or something. And I said, I don't know, why are we reading about the Newer when we're in Japan? I said, and we should take it, we are tourists, and your curriculum is about tourism. Let's just do it. Let's really make it a curriculum about tourism, and we can do participant observation because we are tourists, basically. So we did. Well, that turned out to be a transformative experience. That would set me completely on the path for looking at the relationship between tourism, museum, and heritage. So once I had that kind of experience, and I had it now in 6 different countries. And the beauty of it also was that when you study tourism, you're usually studying a circumscribed event or place. You're studying a festival or a performance, and it repeats. It goes over and over again, or it's a site, and you can go back to it over and over again. It's perfect for a 4 or 6 week visit. So then I really had what to work with, and we co-authored a very nice article called Masai on the Lawn. Really fascinating case study in Kenya. So I think that I have to credit him with taking me along this tourism path. I don't think I would have done it otherwise. I think I was put off by tourism. And in a way, that's always for me a kind of signal that my resistance to the topic is usually a sign that I should figure out why I'm having a problem with it. And then I discover there's something there that's really worth exploring. So that kind of, I think, was a very big factor also.
Now, did that experience then, when you went back to NYU teaching, did it impact the way you were teaching?
Absolutely. I then taught that material. That's my tourist productionist course, came directly from that material. And of course, then I incorporated American material like Plymouth Plantation. Right. And always I did experiential learning, so it meant field work and taking students out and doing stuff like that.
I don't know how we are.
Well, we're getting toward the end of time. Yeah, but we'll do a little more. Can you just touch briefly on how you got the gig in Poland?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll tell you what was it's there. I feel like I've had, interestingly enough, I feel like what I've done in the public sector has been more important than anything I've done in the academic world. That's how I feel. And I know that's odd because I remember in the development of public folklore, the feeling that academics was the gold standard and public folklore was somehow or other a consolation prize, which I've always argued against, as you know. And as somebody that's worked in both fields, in both areas, as an academic and as somebody in the public sphere, I think that when I think about the projects that I feel I've made the greatest contribution, it's Image Before My Eyes, it's the project with my father, it's this museum. These are big projects. They're major, major projects, and they've had, I think, more impact than, I think they've had more impact than my academic work, actually. I think they're the better for having done the academic work, for sure, and it's not a matter of either or. On the contrary, obviously, these are related. So what happened was around 2000, I heard, like in the air, they're creating a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And there was never another sentence. That's all I heard. I thought, that really doesn't sound very promising. Maybe it's some weird guy, he's got some cockamamie idea. and maybe he's thinking I'll make a board exhibition somewhere, and I mean, it's Poland, it's Warsaw, and nobody knows anything about it. And I think to myself, if it's anything serious, there would be more information. Then in 2002, I get this phone call from Jerzy Halberstadt, who is the leader of the project, and he said, he said he's coming to New York. He would like to show me the project. Would I meet with him? I said, sure. So we meet at the Polish consulate in New York, which is on Madison Avenue. It's a beautiful French mansion. It was beautiful. Yeah. It is a French mansion. And now, of course, they've refurbished it. But when I went there in 2002, it looked like the Red Cross had just evacuated. It was, bare light bulbs. It was little cubbies. They divided everything up. It was dingy. And now they've really, it's beautiful. They've fixed it up beautifully. And he was in a guest suite at the very top floor, and it was like this sort of Louis, I don't know what Louis it was, furniture, that threadbare, and anyway, he got out
one of those Louis.
One of those Louis. So he got out his little laptop and he showed me the project, and I say to myself, wow, that looks interesting. So he goes back to Warsaw, and he calls me a couple of months later, would I come to Warsaw for a week to review the work they had done, what that meant was three things. Outline of the historical program, which was like a 120-page document of the history from 960 to the present. 2, a database of materials that could be useful to make the exhibition, whether we had the originals or not. And 3, the master plan. They already had a draft of the master plan for the exhibition. So I said, sure. So I go, and they have, their offices they rented an old little house in the northern part of the main part of the city. And like the floorboards, you can see down to the earth. And I'm thinking to myself, this little house it's falling apart, and they're trying to make this massive, major museum. I don't know. And they put me up in this hotel where clearly the owner's wife or something had made the bedspreads and the curtains in a fluorescent turquoise and orange. It was 2002. So I was really impressed, and I wrote a report. And the fundraiser in New York read the report, and he said, well, now he says, until I read your report, I didn't really know what the project was about. So clearly, I got it and was able to communicate to them what they were actually doing. And we stayed in touch. So how did it come about? Michael Steinlauf, who is an old and dear colleague of mine, teaches at Gretz College. And he had been working closely with Jerzy in Poland. And at a certain point, he said to Jerzy, who was the leader of the project, he said, you should talk to Barbara. So, and Jerzy, being in Poland, not being so connected to the US, he didn't know who I was. I don't expect that he would. So he called. And then when we got to know each other, but it's pretty unusual, child of Polish Jewish immigrants, a child of Polish Jews, with a specialty in East European, Polish, Jewish, Yiddish culture, with museum experience. And the museum experience was not as someone who had only and always worked in a museum,
Right.
but rather had been thinking critically and hopefully interestingly about museums and their history, and especially the ways in which Jews had been presented in museums. It's a very, very, very unusual combination. And with practical experience in curating exhibitions, although nothing like what they were envisioning. So we stayed in touch and met periodically and organized a panel at the Association for Jewish Studies and also some sessions with colleagues to critique the work. And then finally, once the museum was established, actually founded in 2005, then they were ready to take the master plan and develop it as an exhibition. And that was when he asked me to lead that process. And that began in April 2006.
And the museum opened?
We opened the building in April 2013, and we had the grand opening with the exhibition in October 2014.
Mm-hmm. And it's
And
done
it's going
very
strong.
well.
It's doing really well.
Doing
It's
very
doing
well.
great, actually. We have a wonderful director, Daria Stola, And Jerzy Halberstadt, who led the project for 15 years, actually really deserves credit for having given it for having provided the vision and given it the shape that it took.
We could probably go on for hours and hours. Would you like to tell us what your next big project is?
Well, yeah, actually, what I want to do now is write a book about the making of the exhibition.
That
That's
would
what I
be
want to do.
fantastic.
Yeah. Well, you just gave a wonderful Botkin talk about the
Well,
exhibition.
thank you.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming to
Thank you.
Washington. Thank you for sitting for this interview.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate it.
And we'll have you back.
Yes,
I'm ready.
for part 2.
Part 2. Yes. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very,
Thank
very
you.
much, Becky. Thank you. Appreciate it.